What would you do if you were flying a packed aircraft over the Irish coastline at dawn, carrying 215 souls on board, and suddenly saw a woman in white and blue standing perfectly still on the runway ahead? But when you radioed the tower in a panic, they swore on their lives there was absolutely nobody there, that the runway was completely clear, that you must be seeing things? This is the true account of how Our Lady of Knock appeared to save an entire plane load of passengers from certain death over County Clare, and how she forever transformed the life of Captain Liam O'Sullivan, a man who had spent his entire career trusting only in instruments, mathematics, and the cold logic of aviation. But before we go any further, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from right now, what county you're in, what time of day it is, and whether you've ever experienced something you simply couldn't explain. I'd love to know how far the protection of Our Lady of Knock is reaching across this world of ours. Liam woke that September morning at 3:30, the rain pelting against the bedroom window of his cottage just outside Ennis. At 51 years of age, with over 17,000 hours logged in the cockpit and a career spanning nearly 3 decades, Liam had become something of a legend among the pilots of the airline. His colleagues, half joking but half serious, called him the Machine, not because he lacked warmth or humanity, but because of his remarkable ability to remain utterly calm in the face of mechanical failures, weather emergencies, and all manner of crisis situations that would leave younger pilots sweating through their uniforms. He'd flown through lightning storms over the Atlantic that had terrified seasoned crew members. He'd landed planes with failing hydraulics. He'd navigated through conditions that would have grounded less experienced aviators. And through it all, he had maintained that characteristic clear composure that made passengers feel safe even when things were going badly wrong. That morning, as he sat in the small kitchen of the cottage he'd inherited from his late father, Liam followed the exact same routine he'd maintained for the better part of 20 years. Strong tea, 2 sugars, no milk, brewed in the old brown pot that had been his mother's, poured into the chipped mug with the faded Munster rugby crest. He checked the weather reports on his tablet while the tea cooled, scrolling through the meteorological data with the focused attention of someone who knew that the Irish weather could turn on you without warning. The forecast looked grand altogether. Clear skies predicted, light winds from the southwest, visibility excellent. The kind of morning that made flying feel less like work and more like the pure joy that had drawn him to aviation in the first place. Back when he was a young lad watching the planes take off from Shannon and dreaming of the day he'd be at the controls. His wife Siobhan came down the narrow stairs, still in her dressing gown, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She always made a point of seeing him off when he had these early starts, no matter how tired she might be. They'd been married 28 years come November, and in all that time she'd never once failed to say a prayer for his safety before he left for the airport. Siobhan was a woman of deep faith, a daily mass-goer when her health permitted, a member of the Legion of Mary, a woman who kept a statue of Our Lady of Knock on the mantelpiece and fresh flowers before it every week without fail. Liam, for his part, had a more complicated relationship with faith. He'd been raised Catholic, of course, as everyone in Clare had been in those days. He'd made his communion and confirmation. He'd served as an altar boy at the cathedral in Ennis, but somewhere along the way, through years of university in Dublin studying aeronautical engineering, through his training with the Air Corps where everything was about precision and measurable data, he'd drifted into a kind of comfortable agnosticism. He didn't disbelieve exactly, but he didn't actively believe either. He existed in that gray area where many Irish people of his generation lived, culturally Catholic but practically secular, going through the motions at weddings and funerals, but not much moved by the whole thing. "I'll say a rosary for you today, love," Siobhan said, pressing a travel mug of fresh tea into his hands and kissing his cheek. Her fingers were cold, the arthritis that had been troubling her these past few years making the early mornings difficult. Liam nodded, gave her hand a gentle squeeze, but inside he felt that familiar mixture of affection and mild skepticism. 29 years of flying commercial aircraft, over 4,500 successful flights completed without so much as a significant incident, had convinced Liam that safety in aviation came down to 3 things: proper training, rigorous maintenance protocols, and sound decision-making based on data and experience. Prayer, in his view, was something that made people feel better, and he'd never begrudged Siobhan or anyone else their comfort. But he didn't believe it actually changed anything in the physical world. Their children were long grown and moved away. Fife, their eldest at 26, was working as a solicitor in Galway, engaged to be married next summer to a sound lad from Tuam. Cillian, 23, was doing his postgraduate degree in marine biology at UCC down in Cork, passionate about ocean conservation and forever sending them articles about protecting the Irish coastline. Liam was proud of them both, proud that they'd made something of themselves, proud that they'd stayed in Ireland when so many of their generation had emigrated. The cottage felt empty without them, but it was a peaceful kind of emptiness, the kind that comes when you've done your job as a parent and raised decent human beings who can stand on their own 2 feet. At 4:15, Liam backed his aging Volvo out of the drive and headed toward Shannon Airport. The roads were empty at that hour, just the occasional lorry making early morning deliveries, the street lights of Ennis giving way to the darkness of the countryside, the hedgerows pressing close on either side. He drove on autopilot, his mind already running through the flight plan. Today's route would take them from Shannon up over Donegal and across to Edinburgh, a journey of roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes, weather permitting, over some of the most beautiful coastline in Europe. The aircraft he'd be commanding was an Airbus, relatively new to the fleet, only 6 years in service with an exemplary maintenance record and all the latest avionics. It was a pilot's dream, responsive and reliable, the kind of machine that made you feel like you were part of it rather than simply operating it. At Shannon, Liam met his co-pilot in the crew briefing room. Fiona Murphy was 34 years old, from Limerick originally, with 11 years of experience and a sharp mind for the technical side of flying. She was one of the best co-pilots Liam had ever worked with, meticulous about procedures but not rigid, able to think on her feet, and blessed with a dry wit that made long flights pass more pleasantly. "Morning, Captain," she said, already in uniform, the flight documents spread out on the table before her, a takeaway coffee from the terminal cafe steaming beside them. Liam appreciated Fiona's professionalism, the way she never cut corners, the way she double-checked everything without being obsessive about it. They'd flown together dozens of times, and they'd developed the kind of easy working relationship that made cockpit resource management feel natural rather than forced. At 10 minutes to 5, Liam and Fiona made their way out to the aircraft. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that peculiar gray-blue color that comes before dawn in Ireland, the air cold and damp with the promise of rain later, despite what the forecast said. The ground crew were already at work, fueling the aircraft, running through their pre-flight inspections, their breath misting in the morning air. Liam always insisted on doing his own external inspection, a habit he'd picked up during his time with the Air Corps and never abandoned. He walked slowly around the Airbus, his torch beam playing over the wings, the engines, the landing gear, checking for anything that might be amiss, any sign of damage or wear that the ground crew might have missed. Everything looked perfect, the aircraft gleaming under the apron lights ready to carry its passengers safely to Scotland. In the cockpit, Liam began his pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had become second nature over 3 decades of flying. Every switch, every gauge, every system was verified against the checklist, nothing taken for granted, nothing assumed. Fiona worked alongside him, calling out the items, confirming each one as Liam completed it. Outside, the passengers were beginning to board, 215 of them in total, a full flight. Liam could hear the sounds of families settling in, children excited about the journey, the rustling of bags being stowed in the overhead compartments, the flight attendants going through their safety routines. Among those passengers were school groups heading to Edinburgh for educational tours, business people with meetings to attend, elderly couples visiting grandchildren who'd moved to Scotland for work, a priest from County Mayo who'd been on pilgrimage to Knock and was now traveling onward to visit his sister in Glasgow. Ordinary people, ordinary lives, all of them trusting that Liam would deliver them safely to their destination, trusting in his experience and skill and the reliability of modern aviation. At 5:20, Liam requested clearance to start the engines. Shannon ground, Shamrock 247 requesting engine start, he transmitted, his voice calm and professional. The reply came back immediately, the familiar accent of the controller, a Limerick man Liam had known for years. Shamrock 247, cleared to start engines. The Airbus came alive with that distinctive whine of turbines spooling up, the aircraft transforming from a static object into something powerful and purposeful. It was a sound Liam never tired of, that moment when the machine woke up and prepared to defy gravity once again, At 5:30, the pushback began, the tractor easing the aircraft away from the gate, positioning it for taxi. Liam ran through the final checks as they rolled backward. Every system showing normal indications, everything exactly as it should be. He contacted ground control, received his taxi clearance, and began the slow journey along the taxiways toward runway 24, the main east-west runway at Shannon. It was during this taxi, as the aircraft trundled along the perimeter road in the gray pre-dawn light, that Liam first felt something strange. Not wrong exactly, but different. A sense of unusual stillness seemed to settle over him, a kind of profound calm that he couldn't quite account for. It wasn't nerves. God knows Liam hadn't felt nervous before a flight in 20 years, but it was something else entirely. Something he'd never experienced in all his time in aviation. It was as if the air itself had changed quality, as if time had somehow slowed down, as if a presence had entered the cockpit. Though when he looked around, everything appeared completely normal. Fiona was reviewing the departure procedures. The instruments were all reading correctly, the radio chatter was routine. Nothing was out of place, and yet Liam felt unmistakably that something was different. Fiona glanced over at him, catching the subtle shift in his expression. "Everything all right, Captain?" she asked, her voice carrying that distinctive Limerick lilt. Liam nodded, offering her a reassuring smile, but the truth was he couldn't quite shake the feeling. It was as though someone had walked into the cockpit and taken a seat behind them, someone benevolent and watchful, though the jump seat remained empty and the cockpit door was firmly closed. He'd heard other pilots talk about moments like this over the years, usually late at night in hotel bars after long flights, when the drink had loosened tongues and defenses were down. They'd speak in hushed tones about inexplicable feelings of being watched over, about decisions they'd made that saved lives for reasons they couldn't fully articulate, about presences they'd sensed in the cockpit during emergencies. Liam had always dismissed such talk as superstition, the human mind's tendency to find patterns and agency where none existed. But now, feeling this strange calm settle over him like a blanket, he wondered if perhaps he'd been too quick to judge. The aircraft reached the holding point for runway 24 at precisely 27 minutes past 5. The eastern sky was brightening now, streaks of pale gold breaking through the gray, the kind of dawn that reminded you why Ireland was called the land of saints and scholars, why poets had spent centuries trying to capture the quality of Irish light in words. Liam contacted the tower, his voice steady and professional. "Shannon Tower, Shamrock 247, holding short of runway 24, ready for departure." There was a brief pause, the controller coordinating with other traffic, and then the response came through, clear and authoritative. "Shamrock 247, hold position. Expect departure clearance in 2 minutes." Liam acknowledged and settled back in his seat, running through the mental checklist one final time. Everything was perfect. The aircraft was performing flawlessly, the weather was ideal, the passengers were settled, the crew was ready. It should have been the most routine departure imaginable. It was at that moment, while they waited for clearance, that Liam felt the strange sensation intensify. The calmness that had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness now moved to the center, becoming impossible to ignore. His breathing slowed without conscious effort. His heart rate dropped, and time seemed to stretch and distort in a way he'd never experienced outside of actual emergency situations. He found himself thinking of Siobhan, of the way she'd kissed him goodbye that morning, of the rosary beads she kept in the pocket of her cardigan, worn smooth from decades of prayers. He thought of his mother, God rest her soul, who'd died 5 years ago after a long battle with cancer, a woman who'd never missed Sunday Mass in her entire life, who'd kept a picture of Our Lady of Knock on her bedside table and touched it every night before sleeping. He thought of all the times throughout his life when faith had been offered to him like a gift, and how he'd politely declined, believing himself too rational, too educated, too modern for such things. The tower's voice broke through his reverie. "Shamrock 247 cleared for takeoff, runway 24. Liam acknowledged the clearance, his training taking over, his hands moving to the controls with the muscle memory of 3 decades. "Cleared for takeoff, runway 24, Shamrock 247. He released the brakes and the aircraft began to roll forward, turning onto the runway, the nose wheel aligning with the centerline markings. The morning light was stronger now, visibility perfect, everything by the book. Fiona called out the final checks, her voice calm and methodical. "Flap set for takeoff, trim set." Flight controls checked and cleared. Liam placed his hands on the thrust levers, That familiar position he'd assumed thousands upon thousands of times, the moment of transition from earth to sky, from the static to the dynamic. He pushed the levers forward smoothly, feeling the engines respond, hearing that deep-throated roar that never failed to stir something primal in him, the raw power of machinery harnessed to human purpose. The aircraft began to accelerate down the runway, slowly at first, then gathering speed with increasing momentum. Through the windscreen, Liam could see the runway stretching ahead, the lights marking its edges blurring into continuous lines as their velocity increased. Fiona called out the speeds. 50 knots. The acceleration pressed Liam back into his seat, familiar and reassuring. 70 knots. The aircraft was committed now, too fast to safely abort without exceptional cause. In the cabin behind them, passengers would be feeling that same pressure. Some excited, some nervous, some simply waiting for the moment when the wheels left the ground and the real journey began. 80 knots. Liam's eyes scanned the instruments, checking engine performance, airspeed, everything normal, everything perfect. And then, at 93 knots, with the aircraft hurtling down the runway at over 100 kilometers per hour, Liam saw something that would change everything he believed about the world, about faith, about the nature of reality itself. There, directly ahead on the runway, perhaps 200 meters in front of the accelerating aircraft, stood a woman. She was not running, not waving frantically, not showing any of the panic you would expect from someone standing in the path of an aircraft that would reach them in less than 8 seconds. She simply stood there, perfectly still, perfectly composed, dressed in white robes with a blue sash, a veil covering her head, her hands clasped in an attitude of prayer. The morning light seemed to gather around her, not illuminating her so much as emanating from her, as if she carried her own source of radiance. Her face was serene beyond words, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with an expression of perfect peace, perfect love, perfect understanding. For a fraction of a second, Liam's trained mind tried to process what he was seeing through the lens of logic. A ground worker who'd wandered onto the runway? Impossible. There were multiple safety protocols to prevent exactly that. A passenger who'd somehow escaped the aircraft during boarding? Absurd. Everyone was accounted for and the doors had been sealed. A hallucination brought on by fatigue? But Liam had slept well, felt fine, and in any case, hallucinations didn't appear with such crystalline clarity, with such overwhelming presence. No, whatever this was, it was real, it was there, and in less than 7 seconds his aircraft would reach her position. And even though logic insisted that an aircraft couldn't hurt an apparition, couldn't collide with a vision, something deeper than logic, something ancient and fundamental told Liam with absolute certainty that if he did not stop this takeoff immediately, something catastrophic would happen. His reaction was instantaneous, the product of years of emergency training compressed into a single moment of decisive action. "Tower aborting takeoff, person on runway," he shouted into the radio, his voice sharp with urgency even as his hands were already moving, pulling back the thrust levers, deploying the speed brakes, engaging maximum reverse thrust, stamping on the brakes with controlled force that brought the anti-skid system to life. The aircraft shuddered violently as every system worked to scrub off speed, the passengers thrown forward against their seatbelts, bags shifting in overhead compartments, people crying out in surprise and fear. The tires screamed against the runway surface, the reversers howled. The whole aircraft seemed to protest against the sudden demand to transform all that forward momentum into heat and noise and friction. Beside him, Fiona was thrown forward, catching herself against the instrument panel, her eyes wide as she scanned the runway ahead, trying to see what Liam had seen. The tower's response came back immediately, confusion and concern evident in the controller's voice. "Shamrock 247, negative, runway is clear, I repeat. Runway is completely clear, no traffic, no obstruction." But Liam kept the pressure on the brakes, watching as the woman on the runway remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, watching the aircraft as it decelerated toward her position. The distance closed rapidly. 200 meters, 150, 100, and still she stood there. No fear on her face, only that expression of infinite compassion and understanding. At 50 meters, with the aircraft down to perhaps 20 knots, crawling now rather than racing, she moved for the first time, raising one hand in a gesture that was simultaneously a blessing and a warning, and Liam felt a wave of such overwhelming love wash over him that tears sprang to his eyes unbidden. his throat tightening with emotion he couldn't name. The aircraft came to a complete stop approximately 30 meters from where the woman stood. Liam's hands remained on the controls, his body rigid with tension and awe, his eyes fixed on the figure before him. She was so clear, so solid, so undeniably present that it seemed impossible anyone else couldn't see her. The white of her robes was whiter than any earthly white, luminous without being bright. The blue of her sash, the exact blue of the Irish sky on those rare, perfect summer days. Her face was young but ageless, human but somehow more than human. And her eyes, even at this distance, seemed to look directly into Liam's soul, seeing everything he was, everything he'd been, everything he might become, and loving all of it without condition or judgment. "Captain, I don't see anyone," Fiona said, her voice tight with stress, her head craning forward as she stared at the empty runway ahead. "Captain, there's nothing there." But Liam knew what he saw, and more importantly, he knew what he felt. The presence in the cockpit was overwhelming now, palpable, as real as the controls under his hands or the seat beneath him. "Tower, I have visual confirmation of a woman in white and blue standing on the runway directly ahead of our position," Liam transmitted, his voice steadier now, the initial adrenaline surge giving way to something else, a kind of calm certainty. "Approximately 30 meters ahead, center of runway. Request emergency services to secure the area." In the tower, Controller Brendan Casey was staring at his screens in confusion and growing alarm. Brendan was 47 from Galway with 19 years of experience in air traffic control. He'd handled thousands of flights, managed countless emergencies, but he'd never encountered anything like this. Every camera pointed at runway 24 showed it completely empty. The ground radar detected no human presence, no object of any kind except the aircraft itself. The CCTV footage was crystal clear in the bright morning light, showing nothing but empty asphalt stretching away toward the horizon. "Shamrock 247, all our systems show runway clear. No visual from tower, no radar contact, no thermal signature. Dispatching emergency vehicles to your location now," Brendan transmitted, his professionalism holding despite his bewilderment. Within seconds, the emergency response was in motion. Fire trucks and security vehicles raced from their stations, lights flashing, heading toward the aircraft's position. The airport security chief, Declan Walsh, a former Garda from Kerry with 15 years of airport security experience, coordinated the response from the control center, barking orders into his radio, pulling up camera feeds, trying to understand what was happening. On board the aircraft, passengers were beginning to panic. The sudden aborted takeoff had frightened them, and now they could hear the emergency vehicles approaching, see the flashing lights through the windows, and the fear was spreading like wildfire through the cabin. Children were crying, people were demanding explanations. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain calm, but their own confusion was evident. Liam remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the woman. She had lowered her hand now and was simply standing there, watching the aircraft with an expression of such gentle concern that it broke something open in Liam's heart. Some wall he'd built over decades of rationalism and skepticism. He found himself speaking aloud, though whether to Fiona or to himself or to the figure on the runway he couldn't have said. "It's her. It's Our Lady of Knock. Mother of God, it's actually her." Fiona turned to look at him, concern evident on her face. She'd never heard Liam speak like this, had never seen this expression on his face, and for a moment she worried that something had snapped, that the stress of command had finally caught up with him after 3 decades. "Captain, are you feeling all right? Do you need me to take command?" Liam shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off the figure. "I'm perfectly fine, Fiona. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. But I'm telling you, she's there, and we absolutely cannot proceed with this takeoff." The emergency vehicles reached the aircraft within 3 minutes, surrounding it in a semicircle, their crews deploying to inspect the runway. Declan Walsh himself was in the lead vehicle, and he jumped out before it had fully stopped, his eyes scanning the runway ahead of the aircraft. He saw nothing, absolutely nothing, just the empty runway, the morning light, and the aircraft sitting there with its engines idling. He radioed back to the tower. "Runway inspection in progress. No visual confirmation of any person or object. Checking full length of runway." His team spread out, walking the entire area that Liam had indicated, looking for any sign of what the pilot claimed to have seen. They found nothing. No footprints, no debris, no evidence that anyone had been there. The runway surface was pristine, unmarked except for the tire marks from the aircraft's aborted takeoff. Inside the cockpit, Liam watched as the security personnel walked right through the spot where the woman stood. She remained visible to him as clear as ever, and when the men passed through her position, she simply looked at them with that same expression of love and compassion, as if their inability to see her caused her no offense, as if she understood perfectly the limitations of human perception. It was at that moment that Liam noticed something else, something that sent a chill down his spine despite the warmth he felt emanating from the figure. The normal sounds of the airport had faded away. He could still hear the engines of his own aircraft, could still hear Fiona's breathing beside him, could still hear the radio transmissions, but everything else, the distant roar of other aircraft, the ground equipment, the wind, all of it had receded into a kind of gentle silence, as if someone had wrapped the world in cotton wool. And there was a scent, faint but unmistakable, of roses, not the cloying artificial scent of air freshener, but the clean natural fragrance of roses in bloom, impossible in an aircraft cockpit, impossible on a runway, impossible in September in Ireland, and yet there it was, undeniable. Minutes ticked by in this strange standoff. Liam refused to move the aircraft, refused to continue the takeoff, and the emergency services couldn't find any reason for the abort. Brendan in the tower was coordinating with his supervisor, trying to decide what to do. They had a runway blocked, an aircraft full of passengers, and a pilot insisting there was an obstruction that didn't appear on any sensors and wasn't visible to anyone else. It was unprecedented, baffling, and it was creating a massive disruption to the morning's flight schedule. Other aircraft were being diverted to the alternate runway. Controllers were having to rejig the entire sequence of departures and arrivals, and all because Captain Liam O'Sullivan claimed to see a woman in white and blue standing on runway 24. It was at this point, 19 minutes after the aborted takeoff, that something happened in the tower that changed everything. Brendan's colleague, a young controller named Aoife Brennan from Dublin, suddenly gasped and pointed at one of her screens. "Sweet Jesus," she breathed, her face going pale. "Look at the radar logs. Look at what was in our airspace." Brendan moved to her station, leaning over to see what she'd found, and his blood ran cold. There, in the recorded radar data, was the track of an aircraft that shouldn't have been there. A small plane, no transponder signal, no radio contact, flying at dangerously low altitude, and the track showed that it had crossed directly through the airspace above runway 24, between the times of 5:28 and 5:32 in the morning. Right exactly when Shamrock 247 would have been climbing out if they'd departed on schedule. Brendan immediately began pulling up more data, his fingers flying over the keyboard, and what he found made his mouth go dry. The aircraft was a Piper Cherokee, and through coordination with regional air traffic control and local airfields, they quickly identified it. The pilot was Thomas McCarthy, a 63-year-old farmer from near Kilrush in County Clare, who owned a small airstrip on his property. Tomas had taken off from his strip at 4:30 that morning, heading to collect farm equipment from a dealer near Ennistimon. What he hadn't known was that his radio had suffered a complete failure during flight, leaving him unable to communicate with any control towers. With no transponder and no radio contact, he'd been invisible to the normal traffic systems, a ghost plane wandering through controlled airspace. The trajectory data was devastating in its clarity. If Shamrock 247 had departed on schedule, if Liam had released the brakes even 10 seconds earlier, if the takeoff had proceeded normally, the climbing Airbus would have intersected with the Piper Cherokee at approximately 400 feet of altitude, roughly 42 seconds after leaving the ground. At that height, at that speed, with the Airbus's nose pointing upward and accelerating, the closure rate would have given neither pilot any chance to react. The collision would have been inevitable, instantaneous, and absolutely catastrophic. The Airbus, with 215 people on board, would have been torn apart. The Piper would have been obliterated. There would have been no survivors. None. Every person on both aircraft would have died, along with God knows who on the ground, when the burning wreckage came down on the houses and businesses near the airport. The realization spread through the tower like ice water. The controllers stood in stunned silence, staring at the radar tracks at the mathematical certainty of what had been avoided. Brendan picked up his radio with a hand that trembled slightly. "Shamrock 247 Tower, advise you that we have discovered an aircraft with communication failure that translated your departure path during your scheduled takeoff window. Estimated collision point would have been at 400 feet AGL, 42 seconds after your departure. Your decision to abort has likely prevented a catastrophic accident. There was a long pause before Liam responded, and when he did, his voice was thick with emotion. Tower Shamrock 247 understood. The woman is still here. She's still standing on the runway. And she's smiling now. In the cockpit, Fiona had heard the transmission from the tower, had understood immediately what it meant, and she was staring at Liam with an expression of shock and dawning wonder. "Captain," she whispered, "how did you know?" "What did you really see?" Liam turned to look at her, tears now running freely down his face, no shame in them, no embarrassment, just the raw emotion of a man who'd been given a gift beyond comprehension. "I saw Our Lady of Knock, Fiona. I saw the Blessed Virgin Mary standing on this runway, and she was trying to stop us from taking off. She was trying to save all these people." He gestured toward the cabin behind them, where 215 passengers sat, unaware of how close they'd come to death, unaware that they were alive because of what could only be described as a miracle. Fiona was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was very soft. "I didn't see anything, Captain. The runway was empty for me, but I felt something. From the moment we started taxi, I felt like there was someone else with us, someone watching over us." She paused, then added, "My grandmother used to say that Our Lady of Knock watches over all travelers, especially those in the air. She made a pilgrimage to Knock every year until she was too ill to travel. She always said that Mary never abandons her children." Liam nodded, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened, by the gift of life that had been given to everyone on board, by the shattering of his carefully constructed worldview of pure rationalism. As they sat there, with emergency vehicles still surrounding the aircraft and the tower working to understand what to do next, Liam looked again at the figure on the runway. She had begun to fade now, not disappearing suddenly but gradually becoming more translucent, more ethereal, though her presence remained as strong as ever. Her eyes were still fixed on the cockpit, on Liam, and the love in that gaze was so powerful that he felt it like a physical force. She raised both hands now in a gesture of blessing, and Liam found himself raising his own hand in response, a gesture of gratitude, of acknowledgement, of surrender to the reality of the divine. And then as the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the runway with golden light, she was gone. Not vanished, not disappeared, but simply no longer visible. Though Liam knew with absolute certainty that she was still there, still watching, still protecting, just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. The atmosphere in the cockpit changed immediately. The strange silence lifted, the normal sounds of the airport flooding back in. The scent of roses faded, replaced by the familiar smells of aviation fuel and electronics and the slight mustiness of the cabin air. Fiona let out a long breath that she seemed to have been holding for hours rather than minutes. "She's gone, isn't she?" she said quietly. Liam nodded. "She's gone. Her work here is done." He sat back in his seat, suddenly exhausted, feeling as though he'd aged 10 years in the space of 20 minutes. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and an equally deep sense of peace that he'd never experienced before in his life. The tower contacted them again. "Shamrock 247, request your intentions. Are you able to continue with the flight, or do you need to return to gate?" Liam considered for a moment. His training told him that after such an incident, the prudent thing would be to return to the gate, have the aircraft inspected, give the passengers time to recover from the shock. But something else, some inner voice that he was only just beginning to trust, told him that the aircraft was fine, that the danger had passed, that they were protected. Tower Shamrock 247, requesting permission to reposition for departure. Aircraft is serviceable, crew is ready to continue. Beside him, Fiona nodded her agreement, and Liam could see in her eyes that she too felt the same strange certainty, the same sense that they were meant to complete this journey. The tower coordinated with the emergency services. The vehicles pulled back, and slowly, carefully, Liam guided the aircraft back to the start of the runway. As they repositioned, he glanced at the spot where Our Lady of Knock had stood, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw a shimmer in the air, a distortion like heat haze, though the morning was cool. He said nothing, simply completed the repositioning, lined up on the center line again, and went through the pre-takeoff checks once more, this time with Fiona's voice reciting the items with what sounded like a new reverence. As if the simple mechanical procedures had taken on a sacred quality, the tower cleared them for takeoff a second time. Shamrock 247, winds calm, cleared for takeoff, runway 24. Liam acknowledged and pushed the thrust levers forward, and this time the aircraft accelerated down the runway without incident. The speeds increased, 50 knots, 80 knots, 100 knots, and at 143 knots, Liam pulled back gently on the yoke and the aircraft lifted into the air, the wheels leaving the ground, the nose pointing upward toward the brightening sky. As they climbed through 400 feet, exactly where the collision would have occurred, Liam found himself whispering a prayer, the first real prayer he'd said in 20 years. Thank you. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for your protection. Thank you for showing yourself to me when I didn't deserve to see you. The flight to Edinburgh proceeded normally. The passengers, once they'd been given a brief explanation about a technical issue that had required an aborted takeoff, settled down, and the remainder of the journey was peaceful. Liam flew with a new awareness, a heightened consciousness of the miracle of flight itself, of the fact that every safe takeoff and landing was a kind of miracle, that every journey completed without incident was a gift. He kept expecting the skepticism to return, the rational mind reasserting itself with logical explanations for what he'd experienced, but it never did. The memory of that figure on the runway, of those eyes full of love, of that overwhelming presence remained as vivid and undeniable as when it had happened. When they landed in Edinburgh, Liam and Fiona completed their shutdown procedures in silence, both of them still processing what had happened. As the passengers disembarked, many of them stopped to thank the crew, unaware of how literally true their gratitude was, unaware that they were walking away from an encounter with death that had been averted by divine intervention. Among the passengers who stopped to speak to Liam was the elderly priest from Mayo, Father Seamus O'Brien, who was 71 years old and had served parishes across the west of Ireland for 46 years. Father Seamus looked at Liam with eyes that seemed to see more than most people's, and he said quietly, "You saw her, didn't you, Captain? You saw Our Lady?" Liam started, surprised, and Father Seamus smiled gently. "I could feel her presence from the moment we started moving. I've been praying the rosary since we boarded. I knew she was with us for a reason." Liam found himself nodding, the words spilling out despite his usual reserve. "I saw her on the runway, Father. She was standing right there, trying to stop us from taking off. And if we'd taken off when we were supposed to, we'd all be dead now. All of us." Father Seamus reached out and gripped Liam's shoulder. "She has a plan for you, Captain. This wasn't random. She chose to reveal herself to you because you're meant to tell this story, to bear witness to her continued presence in the world. Don't waste this gift. Don't let the skeptics and the rationalists convince you that it wasn't real. You know what you saw. You know what you felt. Hold on to that." The old priest's words hit Liam like a physical blow, not painful but powerful, and he felt something shift inside him, some final barrier crumbling away. The return journey to Shannon later that day was quiet. Liam spent most of it in thought, staring out at the clouds, seeing them now not just as meteorological phenomena but as part of creation, as expressions of something far greater than physics and chemistry. When they landed back at Shannon in the late afternoon, there was a small crowd waiting: airline management, airport officials, even a few journalists who'd gotten wind that something unusual had happened. Liam gave a brief statement, factual and understated, explaining that he'd aborted a takeoff due to a perceived obstruction, and that subsequent analysis had revealed an aircraft with communication failure in the departure path. He didn't mention what he'd seen, didn't speak of the figure in white and blue, not because he was ashamed or doubtful, but because he knew that some things were sacred, some experiences too profound to be dissected and debated by people who hadn't been there. That evening, driving home to Ennis through the gathering dusk, Liam felt like a different person than the man who'd made this same journey that morning. The landscape looked the same, the narrow roads and high hedgerows, the fields stretching away on either side, the lights beginning to come on in farmhouse windows. But he was seeing it all with new eyes, as if someone had adjusted the focus and suddenly everything was sharper, more vivid, more meaningful. When he pulled into his drive and saw the cottage lights glowing warm against the darkening sky, saw Siobhan's silhouette in the kitchen window, he felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to his eyes for the second time that day. Siobhan knew immediately that something had happened. She'd been a pilot's wife long enough to read his moods, to see beneath the surface, and the moment Liam walked through the door, she saw the change in him. "What happened?" she asked, taking his hands in hers, looking up into his face with concern and curiosity. Liam led her to the kitchen table, made them both tea in the old way, strong and sweet, and then he told her everything. He described the strange feeling during taxi, the figure on the runway, the aborted takeoff, the discovery of the aircraft in their flight path, the undeniable fact that everyone on that plane should be dead but wasn't. He told her about the woman's face, about the overwhelming love, about the scent of roses and the silence and the way she'd smiled at him before fading away. Siobhan listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face, and when Liam finished, she got up and went to the mantelpiece where the statue of Our Lady of Knock stood in its place of honor. She brought it back to the table and set it between them. "Look at her face," Siobhan said softly. "Look at the expression." Liam really looked for the first time at the small statue that had been part of their home's landscape for their entire marriage. The serene expression, the compassionate eyes, the gentle smile, the hands positioned in prayer and blessing. It was exactly, precisely, unmistakably the face he'd seen on the runway that morning. The resemblance wasn't approximate or suggestive, it was perfect, and the recognition hit him like electricity. "I knew," Siobhan whispered. "When I woke up this morning before you left, I felt this urgent need to pray for you. It wasn't my usual prayer. It was something more, something desperate almost. I knelt right here in this kitchen for 35 minutes, saying the rosary over and over, begging Our Lady of Knock to protect you, to watch over your flight, to keep everyone safe. I didn't know why I felt that way, I just knew I had to pray, that it was desperately important." She reached across the table and took Liam's hands again. "She heard me, Liam. She heard my prayer and she answered it. She appeared to you because of prayer, because someone who loved you asked for her intercession." Liam sat in silence for a long time, holding his wife's hands, looking at the statue of Our Lady of Knock, understanding finally and completely that he'd been given a gift beyond measure. Not just the gift of life for himself and 215 others, but the gift of faith, the gift of knowing with absolute certainty that there were forces at work in the universe that transcended the material, that the love he'd felt emanating from that figure on the runway was real and eternal, and available to anyone who opened themselves to it. His eyes fell on the small bookshelf beside the fireplace where his mother's old prayer book still sat, the pages yellowed and soft from decades of use, and he stood up, crossed the room, and took it down. He opened it randomly and found himself looking at a prayer to Our Lady of Knock, handwritten in his mother's familiar script in the margin. "Queen of Ireland, watch over all who travel by land, sea, and air. Protect them from danger, guide them safely home, and when their final journey comes, lead them gently into your son's embrace." The next day, Liam requested a meeting with the airline's chief pilot, Captain Brendan Fitzgerald, a Cork man in his late 50s who'd known Liam for 20 years and respected him as one of the most reliable pilots in the fleet. Liam told Brendan the full story, holding nothing back, describing what he'd seen and what he believed had happened. To his surprise, Brendan didn't dismiss it, didn't suggest psychological evaluation, didn't show any sign of skepticism. Instead, Brendan was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You're not the first, Liam. You're not the first pilot to have an experience like this. I've heard stories over the years, always told in confidence, always from pilots I trusted completely. There are things that happen up there, things that can't be explained by instruments or meteorology or physics. I've never spoken of it publicly because people would think we were mad, but I believe you. And I think you need to tell people what happened." That was how Liam began to share his story, first with close colleagues, then with his children, then gradually with a wider circle. Awif and Cillian were stunned, both of them struggling to reconcile their father's lifelong rationalism with this extraordinary claim. But neither of them doubted his sincerity or his sanity. Awif, the solicitor, approached it like a legal case, examining the evidence, the radar tracks, the testimony of the controllers, the indisputable fact that a collision had been avoided, and concluded that something inexplicable had occurred. Cillian, the marine biologist and scientist, had a harder time with it, but he couldn't deny the data, couldn't explain away the timing, and eventually he came to accept that there were indeed more things in heaven and earth than his philosophy had dreamed of. Fiona Murphy, the co-pilot, was profoundly affected by the experience in ways she was still processing months later. Although she hadn't seen the figure on the runway, she'd felt the presence, and the undeniable evidence of the collision that had been avoided changed something fundamental in her worldview. She began attending Mass regularly, something she hadn't done since childhood, and she found herself drawn to learn more about Our Lady of Knock. Reading the accounts of the 1879 apparition, understanding how that small village in Mayo had become one of the most important Marian shrines in the world because 15 ordinary people had witnessed something extraordinary and had the courage to testify to what they'd seen. The story eventually reached the media, though Liam refused all requests for television interviews and kept his public statements minimal. He had no interest in fame or attention, no desire to become known as the pilot who saw the Virgin Mary, but he felt an obligation to bear witness to what had happened, to offer testimony that might strengthen someone's faith or open someone's mind to possibilities beyond the material. The Catholic Church took an interest, as they always did with reported Marian apparitions, and a quiet investigation was conducted, but Liam cooperated only minimally with that process. His experience hadn't been for the Church's validation. It had been personal, intimate, a gift given to him and to the passengers on that flight, and he felt no need for official recognition or approval. What changed most profoundly was Liam's approach to flying itself. He remained technically excellent, still the consummate professional, but now there was a spiritual dimension to his work that transformed it from a job into a vocation. Before each flight he prayed silently, not the rote prayers of childhood but honest, heartfelt conversations with God and Our Lady of Knock, asking for protection for everyone under his care, for wisdom in his decisions, for awareness of any danger. He developed an intuition, a sensitivity to situations that weren't quite right, and his colleagues noticed that when Liam said something needed checking or expressed concern about a condition, he was invariably correct even when the instruments suggested otherwise. Some called it experience, some called it instinct, but Liam knew it was something more, a gift that had been given to him that morning on the runway. He made a pilgrimage to Knock 6 months after the incident, traveling with Siobhan on a cold March day when rain was sweeping across Mayo in horizontal sheets. They attended Mass in the Basilica, stood at the gable wall where the apparition had occurred in 1879, prayed the Rosary in the Chapel of Reconciliation, and Liam found himself weeping again, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude and love. He felt her presence there, the same presence he'd felt in the cockpit, and he understood that what had happened to him wasn't unique or special in the sense of being exclusive, but rather was one instance of a truth that had been occurring throughout history, that the Blessed Mother was always present, always watching, always ready to intervene when asked, when needed, when the moment required it. The farmer, Thomas McCarthy, whose aircraft had been the unknowing threat, never learned the full story. He'd landed safely at his destination, completely unaware that his radio had failed, completely unaware that he'd flown through controlled airspace, completely unaware that he'd come within seconds of being killed in a mid-air collision. When the authorities contacted him afterward about the radio failure and the airspace violation, he was horrified and deeply apologetic, and Liam made sure to reach out to him, to tell him that no harm had been done, that everyone was safe, that there was nothing to forgive. Tomas, a devout man himself, was shaken when he learned how close disaster had come, and he made his own pilgrimage to Knock to give thanks for protection he hadn't known he'd needed. The 215 passengers, for the most part, went on with their lives, never knowing the full truth of how close they'd come to death that September morning. The school children returned from their educational tours in Edinburgh with photos and memories. The business people conducted their meetings and made their deals. The elderly couples visited their grandchildren and then returned home to Ireland. The priest, Father Seamus O'Brien, went back to his parish in Mayo and incorporated the story into his homilies, speaking carefully about divine protection and the continued presence of Mary in the world. Most of them remembered the aborted takeoff as an inconvenience, a moment of fear that passed. Another story to tell about travel mishaps, and that was fine with Liam. The miracle hadn't been for recognition or glory. It had been for life itself, for the simple gift of continued existence, of marriages that continued, of children who grew up with their parents, of parents who saw their children graduate and marry and have children of their own. Years later, Liam would occasionally encounter passengers from that flight. They never recognized him, of course, but he always felt a special connection, a knowledge that he shared something profound with these strangers, that their lives and his were bound together by an experience they didn't even know had occurred. He never told them, never revealed what had happened, but he always said a silent prayer of gratitude when he saw them, thanks that they were alive, that they'd been given the gift of continued life, that Our Lady of Knock had stretched out her hand that morning and stopped a tragedy from unfolding. Now I want to hear from you, and I want you to know that your voice matters in this community we're building together. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you of the power of prayer and the reality of divine protection, I'd be so grateful if you'd take just a moment to subscribe to this channel. We're creating a space here for stories of faith, for testimonies of miracles, for reminders that we're never alone in this world, no matter how dark things might seem. And please leave a comment below sharing where you're from, and whether you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, some moment when you felt protected or guided by a force beyond yourself. Have you ever felt the presence of Our Lady in your life? Has prayer ever been answered in a way that left you amazed? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire me and strengthen the faith of everyone in this community. This is more than just a channel. It's becoming a family of believers from all corners of the world, united by our faith in the power of God's love and Mary's intercession. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who's struggling with doubt, someone who needs a reminder that miracles still happen, that heaven is not distant but intimately involved in our daily lives. Let's spread this message of hope together, and remember that no prayer goes unheard, no cry for help goes unanswered, and Our Lady of Knock, Queen of Ireland and protector of all travelers, is always watching over us with a mother's love that knows no limits. May God bless you and keep you safe in all your journeys, and may you always feel the gentle presence of Our Lady, guiding your path home.